The small boats the Japanese laughed at. In the early months of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific. Its powerful battleships, cruisers, and destroyers swept aside any resistance. In contrast, the United States Navy, still reeling from the disaster of Pearl Harbor, was desperately scrambling to rebuild. Among its arsenal were a few dozen small, wooden attack boats that looked more like sport yachts than warships, the PT boats. PT stood for Patrol Torpedo, and the first time the Japanese saw them, they laughed. These mosquito boats, as they were called, were made of plywood, powered by aircraft engines, and barely over 70 feet long. They carried just a few machine guns and 4 torpedoes. Against the steel monsters of the Imperial Navy, they looked ridiculous. But looks, as the Japanese were about to learn, could be deceiving. The Mosquito Fleet. By 1942, PT boats were deployed throughout the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Operating in small groups, often in darkness, their mission was simple but suicidal: attack Japanese convoys, supply barges, and warships at close range and disappear before the enemy could react. They had speed, surprise, and courage. Each boat was crewed by about 12 to 15 men, led by officers barely in their 20s. Their boats had no armor, no radar, and no backup. But they did have something powerful: the will to fight. One of the most famous PT officers was Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, who commanded PT 109 in the Solomon Islands. His heroism after his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer became legendary. But Kennedy was far from alone. Across the Pacific, hundreds of PT crews were striking back, night after night, in some of the most dangerous naval missions of the war.
The Japanese convoys. As Japan expanded its empire, it relied on vast networks of convoys to move troops, oil, and weapons across the Pacific. These convoys, often consisting of transports, freighters, and troopships, were escorted by destroyers and patrol craft. At first, Japanese commanders dismissed PT boats as a nuisance. Their wooden hulls seemed too fragile to pose any threat. Their torpedoes early in the war were unreliable, and they were small, almost invisible compared to the massive warships that ruled the seas. But soon, reports started coming in that didn't make sense. Convoys disappearing in the night? Ships sinking without warning? Survivors reporting attacks by small enemy boats that came out of the darkness. The Mosquito Fleet was biting hard.
4 torpedoes, 9 ships. On October 22, 1943, a group of PT boats from Squadron 9, operating out of Vella La Vella, intercepted a Japanese troop convoy bound for Kolombangara. The Japanese had 9 transports escorted by destroyers, a formidable force. Lieutenant John Bulkeley, commander of the squadron, ordered a coordinated attack. His boats, PT-218, PT-222, PT-227, and PT-241 moved silently through the waves. Radar contact confirmed the convoy was just 5 miles away. The PTs spread out, each armed with 4 torpedoes, preparing for a simultaneous strike. At 02:15 a.m., the night erupted. The first torpedoes roared from their tubes, leaving glowing trails in the dark sea. Within seconds, explosions tore through the Japanese formation. One transport went up in flames, another broke apart amidships. The destroyer Amagiri, the same ship that had sunk Kennedy's PT-109 months earlier, opened fire, spraying the sea with 5-inch shells. Tracers lit up the night, but the PTs zigzagged away, engines screaming. By dawn, 9 Japanese transports lay burning or sunk, their wreckage scattered across the Solomon Sea. The entire convoy had been annihilated by just 4 wooden boats and a handful of men. A wooden boat with the heart of a battleship. After that night, Japanese intelligence began to warn that PT boats were dangerous and unpredictable. They were no longer seen as toys, but as floating vipers that could strike without warning. The Imperial Navy increased its convoy escorts, ordered heavier anti-aircraft guns on transports, and even deployed small sub-chasers to hunt PT bases. But the Mosquito fleet was too quick, too stealthy, and too determined. By late 1944, PT squadrons were operating from the Philippines, Borneo, and Mindoro, attacking Japanese shipping and barge traffic. In the Battle of Ormoc Bay, PT boats sank multiple transports carrying Japanese reinforcements to Leyte, a key victory that helped secure the American landing. Their nightly ambushes crippled Japan's ability to move supplies, hastening its defeat.
The legacy of the PT boat crews. By the end of the war, PT boats had sunk or destroyed hundreds of enemy barges and transports, tens of thousands of tons of Japanese shipping, and even several warships, including destroyers. Their losses were heavy, more than 70 boats and 500 crewmen, but their courage was unmatched. Many PT officers went on to become legends. John D. Bulkeley, who earned the Medal of Honor for daring raids in the Philippines, Kennedy, whose leadership after PT-109 sinking became world famous, Robert Kelly, William Liebenau, and Robert Sears, who led night attacks in the Solomons and New Guinea. These men proved that even the smallest vessel, in the hands of determined sailors, could change the course of a battle. Epilogue. From Mockery to Legend. After Japan's surrender in 1945, a Japanese admiral reportedly remarked, "The small American torpedo boats were a great menace, like angry hornets that would not die." From being dismissed as toothpicks with engines, PT boats became one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. Their speed, surprise, and courage earned them a permanent place in naval legend. Today, only a few PT boats survive, restored in museums, their wooden hulls still smelling faintly of salt and oil. But in every plank, every scar, lies the story of the men who went to war in plywood boats and came home as heroes.
Japanese convoys mocked PT boats, until 4x torpedoes sank 9 transports per night. Why the Japanese mocked the PT boats? When the U.S. Navy first deployed PT boats, or Patrol Torpedo Boats, in the Pacific in 1942, they looked ridiculous compared to the massive steel destroyers and cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Material, built from laminated mahogany, not steel. Size, barely 80 feet long, compared to 300 to 600 feet for destroyers. Armor, none. A single 20mm cannon shell could rip through their hull. Endurance, limited fuel. They couldn't travel far from base. To the Japanese, who had perfected precision-built warships with massive guns, these little wooden boats looked like fishing craft. Japanese intelligence called them mosquito boats, or hachinoboto, believing they were merely reconnaissance craft with no real offensive capability. Their mistake? They underestimated American innovation and the power of guerrilla-style naval warfare. The secret weapon? Speed and surprise. Each PT boat carried 3 Packard V12 engines, producing over 4,500 horsepower combined. Top speed? Up to 45 knots, 83 kilometers per hour, faster than most destroyers. At night, that speed turned them into phantoms. They could dart in, fire torpedoes, and vanish before the Japanese gunners even turned their turrets.
PT boats were also the first naval units to use smoke screens and stealth approaches at sea, hugging coastlines, using the black silhouettes of islands as cover. In naval combat, where visibility and detection were life or death, that agility was devastating.
The Torpedoes. Small boats, big punch. Each PT boat carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing nearly 3,000 pounds and capable of sinking a destroyer. In the early days, these torpedoes were unreliable. Sometimes they ran too deep or failed to detonate. But by 1943, new models like the Mark 13 were improved with contact fuses and shallower settings, perfect for convoy attacks. This allowed a squadron of just a few PT boats to deliver 16 heavy torpedoes in a single run, the same striking power as a submarine wolf pack. When they attacked in coordination, each boat would take a flanking position, forming a deadly triangle that trapped Japanese ships in a crossfire. A convoy that expected slow, predictable submarines instead faced lightning-fast assassins on the surface. The Night Hunters of the Pacific. The PT boats' true advantage was darkness. They owned the night. Japanese ships usually relied on visual spotting or searchlights, but in the pitch-black nights of the Solomon Islands, those methods failed. The U.S. Navy gave PT boats early versions of radar, like the SO radar system, allowing them to track ships beyond visual range. While the Japanese were blind, PT captains could see convoys as green blips on their radar screens, guiding them to perfect ambush positions. Their hit-and-run tactics were psychological warfare. A convoy that thought it was safe at night would suddenly explode in fire and chaos, torpedoes slamming into hulls, flames rising out of the dark sea. By dawn, silence. The toy boats were gone.
When the Mockery died, the convoy massacres. Japanese mockery turned to terror after multiple high-profile convoy attacks. Kolombangara, 1943, PT squadrons ambushed a convoy, sinking multiple transports and damaging destroyers. Ormoc Bay, 1944, PT boats blocked Japanese reinforcements to Leyte. They sank 6 transports and 2 escorts in one night. Mindoro, 1944, PTs destroyed entire fuel convoys before they could resupply the Japanese army. What made these attacks extraordinary was not just the destruction. It was that tiny wooden boats were crippling Japan's massive supply lines. Every transport lost meant hundreds of soldiers stranded, fuel undelivered, and weapons lost forever. By 1945, Japan's southern supply routes were collapsing, strangled not by carriers or battleships, but by plywood boats with torpedoes. The men behind the boats. The average PT sailor was young, 19 to 25 years old, and fearless. They called themselves the Mosquito Fleet. Every night they went out, knowing that one lucky shell could turn their wooden hull into a fireball. They fought close, often within 500 yards of Japanese ships. Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley, commander of PT-41, became one of the most decorated officers of the war after rescuing General MacArthur from Corregidor and attacking Japanese ships off Bataan. He earned the Medal of Honor for missions so bold that even MacArthur said, "Bulkeley's torpedo boats were the only offensive weapon we had." Lieutenant Junior Grade John F. Kennedy's PT-109 became legend after being rammed by the destroyer Amagiri. Kennedy saved his crew by towing a wounded sailor from miles through shark-infested waters. These men were cut from a different cloth. Improvisers, brawlers, sailors who fought with everything they had in boats held together by courage and duct tape.
The strategic genius. Small boats, big impact. Here's the part that few realize. PT boats didn't just sink ships. They rewrote naval strategy. They proved that small, fast, low-cost vessels could cripple a superior fleet when used intelligently. A PT boat cost around $200,000 compared to $10 million for a destroyer. It could be built in weeks, not months. Dozens could be launched from jungle bases or seaplane tenders. This allowed the U.S. to flood the Pacific with mobility and chaos, hitting Japanese shipping anywhere, anytime. Every convoy that moved after 1943 had to factor in the risk of PT ambush, forcing Japan to divert escorts, slow convoys, and burn more fuel. In war economics, that's called asymmetric advantage, when the cheap weapon drains the enemy's expensive logistics. From laughter to respect. By 1945, captured Japanese naval officers admitted that the PT boats were one of their most frustrating enemies. They called them unpredictable devils. Reports described how Japanese sailors would refuse night convoys through certain waters known to be PT-infested. Others would fire wildly into the dark at phantom wakes, wasting ammunition and morale. The Japanese Navy learned too late that psychological warfare could be waged by courage and speed, as much as by guns and armor. The toothpicks they once mocked had become the daggers that bled their empire dry.
The legacy of the PT boats. By war's end, the U.S. had built nearly 600 PT boats. They served in the Philippines, Borneo, New Guinea, the Solomons, and the English Channel. They sank or damaged over 300 Japanese ships and barges, dozens of supply convoys, and even several destroyers and patrol craft. The PT boat became a symbol of American ingenuity, small, aggressive, unrelenting. Its crews went home as heroes. Some became senators, engineers, and captains of industry, carrying with them the lessons of courage and innovation that plywood taught steel. Conclusion: mock us again if you dare. The story of the PT boats is not just about naval combat. It's about the arrogance of power and the surprise of resilience. The Japanese thought size and armor meant victory, but the Americans proved that speed, brains, and willpower could rewrite the laws of war. 4 torpedoes, 9 ships, 1 night, and a message that echoed across the Pacific. Never underestimate the heart of a small ship with big guns and bigger men.
Small, fast, and adaptable forces, used with surprise, daring, and clever tactics, can defeat larger, better-armed opponents by disrupting their logistics and exploiting their vulnerabilities.